Idaho was the kind of place where silence was part of the air, the sort of quiet that people mistook for safety. It was a small college town, stitched together by late-night coffee shops, library lamps glowing through frosted windows, and students who believed the world was still gentle enough to trust. That illusion broke one cold night in November 2022, when 4 students were found dead in a rental house on Oak Ridge Hill. No one saw it coming. No one even heard it happen. In the days that followed, Riverview didn't just lose 4 young lives, it lost the sense that evil could be recognized. Because the face of the suspect, when it finally emerged, was not the monster people expected. It was the face of Ethan Cole, a 28-year-old criminology graduate student, the kind of person who studied how killers thought, who spent years dissecting human motive and criminal behavior. Now, the town wondered whether his research had been more than academic, whether it had been practice. The investigation began as confusion. There were no clear witnesses, no sign of forced entry, no sound that carried through the cold November air. Detectives pieced together timelines, phone pings, surveillance flickers, each fragment like glass in a mosaic too dark to make sense of. And beneath every lead was a deeper question. Not how the murders happened, but why. Because every clue that surfaced seemed to orbit one thing: control. Control. Ethan Cole had been an outsider most of his life. Former classmates described him as brilliant but detached, someone who watched human interaction, like a scientist studying animals in a cage. He spoke rarely, and when he did, it was with a strange precision, as if he were editing his words in real time. Some called it intelligence, others called it emptiness. But in psychology, that kind of emotional flatness often hides something else, a mind that feels disconnected from empathy, yet desperate for recognition. His academic work revolved around criminal deviance and forensic behavior. Professors admired his insight, though many admitted in hindsight that his essays carried a disturbing undercurrent, almost an admiration for control, a fascination with dominance, and an obsession with how fear shapes human response. In one paper he wrote, "Fear is the purest form of truth. When stripped of choice, humans reveal what they really are." It was meant as theory. But to investigators, it began to look like a manifesto. The victims were ordinary students, chosen not for who they were, but perhaps for what they represented: freedom, belonging, the life Ethan Cole could study but never join. They lived in a world he could only observe, never inhabit. And that kind of exclusion over time can become a psychological wound, a quiet resentment that ferments into obsession. When law enforcement finally tracked Ethan down, it wasn't a cinematic capture. He was stopped during a late-night drive across state lines. His expression, officers said, was unreadable. No panic, no denial, just the calm of someone whose internal chaos had finally found a shape. His DNA, they alleged, linked him to the scene. His car matched surveillance footage. His phone had gone dark during the hours of the killings. Every puzzle piece slid into place with unnerving precision. But the story didn't end with arrest, it deepened. Because what disturbed psychologists most wasn't the evidence, it was the psychology behind it. Ethan's calmness, his detachment, his analytical responses when questioned. He never confessed, never denied. He simply observed, as if the process itself was another experiment. When asked about emotion, he spoke of data. When asked about motive, he spoke of patterns. To those who studied criminal psychology, his behavior resembled a form of compartmentalization, the ability to split emotion from action so completely that guilt becomes irrelevant. Some saw it as narcissistic personality disorder. Others described it as a dissociative structure, a mental detachment so profound that empathy feels like fiction. Whatever it was, it made him unreadable. In court, as the trial unfolded from 2023 to 2025, the world watched not just a case but a mind being dissected in real time. The defense spoke of mental health, of trauma, of alienation. The prosecution spoke of planning, of power, of predation. But beneath every argument was the same haunting question. What happens when someone who studies darkness begins to live inside it? The witnesses painted a portrait of a man who was invisible until he wasn't. A professor recalled how Ethan lingered after lectures, asking about case methodology, not with curiosity, but with hunger. A former classmate described him as someone who studied people like puzzles. Neighbors said they barely noticed him, even though he was always around. Invisible, methodical, controlled, prosecutors argued that the killings weren't impulsive. They were a test, an enactment of theory. The victims weren't chosen for revenge but for their vulnerability, for their symbolic weight in Ethan's fractured world. He didn't kill out of rage, but out of the need to feel something he couldn't otherwise access. Power. Psychologists call it cognitive empathy without emotional empathy. It's the ability to understand what people feel, but not to feel it yourself. In those minds, human beings become data points. And for someone like Ethan, the idea of fear, pure primal fear, might have been the one thing he could still recognize as real. As the trial progressed, the nation watched the clash between intellect and morality. The defense tried to humanize him, an isolated student lost in the labyrinth of his own research. The prosecution described a predator who used intelligence as camouflage. But both sides agreed on one thing: Ethan Cole was different. He wasn't chaotic, he was calculated. Behind the scenes, forensic psychologists studied his behavior in court. The steady posture, the absence of visible anxiety, the rare, misplaced smile during testimony. They noted how he watched every word, every gesture, not defensively, but analytically. It was as if the courtroom itself had become his new experiment, and everyone else were subjects. The media called him the invisible intellect. Social feeds turned the case into spectacle. Debates, podcasts, documentaries. But the more people tried to explain him, the more his silence spoke louder. Because in that silence was the unsettling truth. Maybe there was nothing to find. Maybe the emptiness wasn't hiding anything. Maybe it was the whole story. By 2025, the trial had become less about guilt and more about meaning. What drives a human being to observe life instead of living it? To study emotion without ever feeling it? Psychologists revisited his academic history, tracing years of obsessive study about criminal minds, control, and fear. One therapist testified that Ethan once described his interest in killers as the study of what happens when empathy fails. No one could tell if he understood the irony. Outside the courtroom, Riverview changed. Students no longer left doors unlocked. Cafes closed earlier. Conversations grew quieter. The tragedy had become a psychological wound, a community learning that the most dangerous kind of monster doesn't look like one. It looks like a neighbor, a student, a man sitting alone in a coffee shop with a laptop and a blank stare. Even now, the question lingers, not about how it happened, but why. Did Ethan Cole act out of curiosity, envy, detachment? Or was it something deeper? A moment when a mind, too consumed by understanding darkness, finally became it? What makes this case so chilling isn't just the crime. It's what it reveals about us, about the human capacity to disconnect, to intellectualize suffering, to become numb to empathy in a world that rewards observation over connection. Ethan Cole may have been unique in his methods, but his mindset, that cold, analytical distance, is something society quietly encourages in 1,000 smaller ways. As the verdict approached, the world waited for answers. But when they came, they didn't satisfy. Because no sentence, no psychological label, no courtroom drama could explain what had broken inside that mind, or whether it was ever whole to begin with. Today, Riverview has returned to a version of calm. The houses are occupied again, laughter echoes faintly through the university halls, and the town pretends time has healed. But some nights, when the wind moves through the trees the wrong way, people remember and wonder how close they once were to someone who studied evil not from fear, but from fascination. Maybe that's what makes stories like this one so haunting. Because the danger isn't just in what one person did, it's in the reflection we see when we look at them too long. And so the question remains not about Ethan Cole or Riverview or even the victims. It's about us. When we stare into the psychology of evil long enough, when we analyze and dissect it, when we make it the center of fascination, do we risk becoming a little colder ourselves? What if the line between observer and participant isn't as clear as we think?